Introduce our speaker, David Boufford. I had the pleasure of traveling with a joint NC State Zhejiang University, is that right?
Study abroad.
Zhejiang University, who are students from both groups for 3 weeks in China. Look at the plants, the culture. It was fascinating. David's education from Keene State College, which we have somebody else in the audience from Keene State. I got the impression that's not too often you get two people from Keene State in one room. But David also did his master's at Chapel Hill. No booing, but out from Chapel Hill, Dr. Radford, who worked on the Flora of the Carolinas, and then the University, Washington University in St. Louis, the Missouri Botanic Garden in St. Louis. He's worked at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh and has been with the Arnold Arboretum and Harvard University since the early 80s in the herbarium there. So pretty significant places. He's a visiting professor with a whole slew of folks, the Northeast Forest University in Harbin, China, Zhangjiang University in Guangzhou, China, University of Tokyo, Shenzhen Fairy Lake Botanical Garden. Most recently is a board member of the DMZ Forum, Preserving Korea's Demilitarized Zone for Conservation and Peace. That sounds like a dangerous duty there. He works on the floristics and monographic and phytogeographic studies of Eastern North America, Asian flowering plants, and the flora and vegetation of temperate to subtropical Eastern Asia. He's had field experience all over the Eastern U.S., Canada, Japan, everywhere in China, Madagascar, Malaysia, Myanmar, Nepal, South America, South Korea, Tanzania. I sometimes try and remember all these things and do this without paper, but I don't think I could. If you're like me and you spend a lot of time dealing with floras, looking up plants, his name is well known to you. He's on the editorial committee for the Flora of North America, the Flora of China, and if you ever go online to the online Flora of China, his photos, especially from this, are always on there. Flora of Taiwan, the Flora of Japan, the genera of vascular plants of Korea. Basically, he goes everywhere that there are good plants for us here. He's been published in every journal of taxonomic significance and has almost 200 different papers and books and published writings. So please join me in welcoming David to talk about the Hengduan Mountains, hotspot of biodiversity.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I was very surprised when I arrived yesterday to find out this was canceled. Sorry I brought the bad weather from Boston. What I want to talk about tonight is field work we've been doing in China, mostly on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau for about the last 20 years. And I'll discuss the flora and some of the characteristics, and also talk about the geology of the areas, the climate, and some of the culture in the area, because a lot of doing field work is meeting with the people who live in the areas and learning more about their cultures. So I'll start now. The area that we work in is one of the 34 biodiversity hotspots. The hotspot concept was developed in the late 1980s by a guy named Norman Myers, and he determined by looking at plants in different areas that some parts of the world were much richer than others, and he called these areas hotspots. And the idea was if you could preserve these hotspots, that you could preserve a very large amount of the world's plants and animals. The animals especially, because they're dependent on the plants. So right now, the Conservation International organization recognizes 34 hotspots. They contain about 50% of the world's plant species. They contain about 36% of all the terrestrial vertebrates, and they occupy only 2.3% of the land area of the Earth. So if you could save this 2.3%, you could save half the plants in the world. That's the idea. And these areas are scattered all around the globe. There are a few in North America, but this one in China is probably not very well known. but it's very interesting and very peculiar. The area is located on the southeast edge of the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. It's an area where 4 or 5 major rivers drain the plateau. It extends to southern Gansu province in China, down to the eastern edge of the Himalaya. There's one high mountain, Namjabawa, and we, for our area, we define that as the western edge of the Hengduan area. It's mostly about 4,000 meters, but drops down to about 2,000 meters on the Yunnan Plateau. The Himalaya here are a major barrier for lots of things. It's a rain shadow. When the monsoon rains come up from the south, they hit the front edge of this mountain and stop. But farther to the east, the rains can penetrate up into this area. The interesting thing about the Hengduan area is that the rivers run north-south, and there are high mountain ridges between the rivers, and each one of those blocks the rain. So on the western side of the ridges, they're very wet. On the eastern side, they're very dry. And I can show you some examples in some of the slides coming up. The area is also very active geologically. If you think back to 2008, the major earthquake in Sichuan occurred up in this area. And the land is still moving. India is still sliding north. Here it's moving north at about 50 millimeters a year. As you go farther north, it's 40 millimeters. So in this area, it's still being compressed. Instead of going down into the earth, these mountains are still being uplifted. And erosion is happening too, so that they're staying at about the same height. They're also being uplifted in this area because there's squeezing going on. Here they're going north, here they're going to the east, and here they're also going to the east. There are many faults. The reason these rivers are here is because there are major faults in the earth. And this is a center of often very severe earthquakes. These are the major rivers that we deal with. They start with the Gentiana, which is the name for the upper part of the Yangtze River. It flows to the east from the Tibetan Plateau, goes down through here, and then the Mekong, the Salween, the Irrawaddy, and then over here is the Brahmaputra. These rivers provide water for about 1/3 of all the people on Earth. If you think of India and China and all the Southeast Asian countries, it's really amazing that these rivers are very, very important. And as I go on, I'll mention that there are some threats to these rivers now. The Red River here in Vietnam is quite interesting. It's believed that at one time the Red River connected with the Yangtze, the upper Yangtze. And this river flowed south into the Indian Ocean. But then the Yangtze worked its way back and it captured the upper part of the Red River. So now, instead of flowing south, the Yangtze flows to the east. And there's some evidence for this. I'll mention this place too. It's called Tiger Leaping Gorge. This is one of the deepest gorges on Earth. But the evidence that these rivers were connected at one time is that there are a lot of fish and animals that live in these rivers that occur nowhere else. This is a giant soft-shelled turtle. There are only 4 of them left in the world. 2 of them are in the Red River, and 2 are in the lower part of the Yangtze River. There are none in any other rivers in eastern China, and none in southern China. So that seems to provide some good evidence. These are very large turtles. They weigh 70 to 100 kilograms. That's 150 to over 200 pounds. So rather amazing. There are only 4 left. They're trying to breed them, but so far very unsuccessfully. I mentioned Tiger Leaping Gorge. This is Tiger Leaping Gorge here. It's the Yangtze. It takes a bend and it's flowing almost to the northeast. So the mountains on this side are to the east and this side to the west. This is the Jade Dragon Snow Mountain. It goes up to almost 5,600 meters, or 18,360 feet. Haba Snow Mountain on the left is 17,700 feet. The river here is about 1,900 meters. If you know Mount Mitchell, if you stuck Mount Mitchell in the middle of this river, there would only be a little bit sticking up above the river. But the elevational difference between the river and the tops of these mountains is 3,700 meters, or over 12,000 feet difference in elevation. So one of the very deepest gorges in the world. And these mountains are very, very close together. You can be on one side and see the top of either one. The other picture on the right is the Mekong River as it's leaving Tibet. The Mekong rises in eastern Tibet and flows down through Yunnan and then down into Southeast Asia. And again, these are little villages built on terraces along the river. And these are footpaths. The only road is up here, very high above the river. And you know, in the United States, I always think it's interesting when we see kids going to school in the morning, the parents drive them, or they get the school bus and go. Well, here the kids go to school, they walk along the edge of this cliff, and there are landslides, and landslides like this, all kinds of dangers. And it's really amazing to think about how different life is in this part of the world. I mentioned the rain shadows. This is the upper Yangtze River. It's called a Jinshajiang, which means gold sand river, because it carries an awful lot of sediment. And romantically, it's called gold sand. It's just basically mud. But this is on the border of Sichuan and Tibet. This is a very dry area. The rainfall in the Hengduan area ranges from about 11.8 inches to 181 inches. And to compare that, Raleigh has about almost 47 inches. Massachusetts has about 44 inches. So there's very little rainfall. This is like a desert, and this is almost like rainforest. This is the desert area. These are all resurrection for Selaginella. They're all curled up because it's very dry. And when it rains, these open up. This is another species of Selaginella on the ground. These are very adapted to dry conditions. If you go into Mexico, the deserts in Mexico, or even in South Texas, you can find plants like this. In very wet areas, you have terrestrial leeches. You know, anybody who's gone swimming in North America, Eastern North America, you go swimming, you get leeches on your legs. Well, in Eastern Asia, if you go walking in the forest and it's wet, there are leeches on the shrubs, they're on the ground, they crawl on your legs, they get into your shoes, they fall down your neck. They're really pretty terrible. But they don't carry disease, they're just a real nuisance. And when they bite you, they release an anticoagulant, so that if you scrape them off, you just keep bleeding for an hour or two afterwards. It's a very powerful anticoagulant. And for people, when they first experience it, they just get really grossed out by the whole thing. You know, these things, you don't feel them, and the next thing you know, your foot feels wet. And it's because you're bleeding into your socks. And then you open up your socks and you find something like this. People scream and holler. But the area is quite interesting because there are a number of China's national minorities who live in the area. Mostly they're Tibetan, but on the bottom there are Nashi people, Yi people, Miao, Bai people. And you can see these people as you're going through the area. They still wear their traditional dress, especially the older people. Younger people dress more the way we do. But it's very interesting that they have their own cultures and beliefs, and many things are unique to these nationalities. But the area is mostly Tibetan. And so everywhere you go, you see signs of Tibetan culture. The monasteries and temples, Tibetan people, nomadic people in the summer, they bring their animals to high elevation. This is on the Tibetan Plateau. In the winter, they bring the animals to low elevation, but in the summer, they bring them up high where the meadows are better. The meadows are not particularly good in this area, so there's not many animals. But Tibet is a very huge area, and it was very hard to communicate. So from one place to another, the clothing and the cultures are quite different. People from one part of Tibet often can't speak to a person from a distant part of Tibet. The languages even evolved to become quite different. Tibetan houses are quite characteristic, and you see these all over the place. generally within one valley, all the houses look alike. And then you go to the next valley and you recognize that these are Tibetan houses, but they're slightly different. So in different areas you find houses like this or like this or like this. And I think it's like the founder effect in biology, where the valley becomes too crowded and they can't grow enough food or raise enough animals, so one family may move out, this was years ago, moved to a new valley, and they remember what the old house looked like and they build a new one, but there may be minor differences. And then everyone who comes after copies that pattern. And so all the houses in that valley look the same, and so on all through the area. That's my theory, I'm not sure. But the houses look very similar. They're rammed earth. They build a wood frame and then they pack earth in it and ram it, and then build a roof on top.
What's blooming up there?
These are Primulas and Pedicularis. If you go into one of these houses, though, they look very simple on the outside. We ended up staying in one of these houses one night. We had some guides that were taking our equipment up in the mountains on horses, and the guides got lost. We went up a steep trail and got to where we were going, and we waited. And it started getting dark, and we had to come down because we had no tents or sleeping bags. We went to one of these houses, and they let us stay there. There were 14 of us.
Wow.
There was a house like these. And inside the house, there's
Oh,
always
wow.
a prayer room. And these are incredibly elaborate. The insides of these houses are
Wow.
painted so fantastically. And this is all done by the local farmers. They have long winters with not much to do, and they can take the time. They can take the time to do this kind of work. This area was first explored by Westerners, the French missionaries, back in the late 1800s. They mostly went there from France. There were a few from Italy, a few from other countries, but the French primarily were the main missionaries in the area. They were not only missionaries, but they were also trained naturalists. They collected plants and they sent them back to Europe, where they were described. Most of them went to Paris, since these were mostly French. It was a very rough life at the time because many of them were murdered. The Buddhist monks felt threatened that they were converting people to Christianity and taking their flocks away from them. So a lot of these monks were murdered by monks. The missionaries were murdered by monks. This is just 100 years ago. But the plants they brought back were so fantastic that it caused a lot of people in Europe to become very excited. They wanted to get some of these to grow in gardens. And so the people who followed the missionaries in the early to middle part of the 1900s were primarily people looking for horticultural plants, like Frank Kingdom Ward or George Forrest. They went into these areas and collected seeds of rhododendrons and primulas and Echinopsis to send back to Europe. And then there were scientific collectors like Handel Mazzetti and Camilo Schneider. And they went primarily to learn about the flora. They sent back all these specimens that were studied and written up. But one of the most famous people who went to China was Joseph Rock. Everybody in China in this area still knows Joseph Rock. He was a very, I guess you'd say, eccentric person. He was an Austrian who went to Italy and then migrated to the United States. He became an American citizen and became a professor at the University of Hawaii. But then he went to China and he really fell in love with China. And it was sort of a love-hate relationship because he wrote very glowing things about what he saw, but also very damning things about what he saw. So there's a biography of him that's quite interesting. And some of his papers are available on the internet. But there are people in the areas where he lived that still remember him. These are Nashi people. He lived with the Nashi people for a number of years. And he stayed there during the winters. And one of the things he did, besides collecting plant specimens and bird specimens, was translating the Nashi language. He made a dictionary of the Nashi language. The Nashi used pictographs, real pictographs, not Chinese characters. And Rock is famous among linguists for being able to do this work. He also sent back many letters, and he wrote many articles for National Geographic. If you go to the National Geographic magazines in the 1920s, there are a lot of articles by Rob. And his writings, people believe, led to the writing of this book called Lost Horizon. It was the first mention of Shangri-La, that you find this valley high up in the mountains and go down in the valley and people live for hundreds of years and they never age. It's just an ideal place to live. There was a movie made of the book in 1937, Lost Horizon. At the time, it was the most expensive movie, $2.7 million. This was during the Depression. And this is sometimes available on the internet. If you have a chance, you should watch it. It's a really interesting movie. It's been remade a couple of times in the 1950s and again, I think, around 1960. But the original is much, much better. It's very interesting. Because of the richness of the plants in the area, there are a lot of organizations that have been going there or pointing it out as a center of diversity. Nature Conservancy has an office in Yunnan Province. Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund. And one of the main reasons is because of the panda. The panda also lives in this area. That's the what they call the flagship species. But it's really the plants, I think, that make this area so unique. Besides the French missionaries and the early scientists and explorers that went into this area, in the 1930s and 40s, there were also a large number of Chinese botanists who went to the area. And they sent back lots of specimens, so that we know much more about that area than from just what the Westerners sent back. And we're very fortunate at Harvard because we have a lot of specimens collected by these people. We had a director of the Arnold Arboretum at one time who sent money to China to finance expeditions by these people or to purchase specimens from them. So we've ended up with a very rich collection of plants, largely because of the foresight of the directors, past directors. You can, in the top photo, you can tell who's the native and who's not. The natives don't wear any stockings on their legs, but these people, outsiders, come and they wrap their legs with linen. And this is to protect them from the leeches. And the leeches are really bad.
Yeah.
They go up to almost 10,000 feet, so you almost can't escape them. We often wonder how they dried plants in the past. You know, when we make specimens, we use various means. The top, this is a dryer. It uses kerosene heat. It's kerosene cooking stove. Recent years, we've been able to use electricity. Now there's electricity in much of this area, so we hook up electric space heaters, and that will dry the specimens. We've used Tibetan stoves, a wood stove inside somebody's house. This is not lasted. This is just a picture on somebody's wall. And then sometimes the only electrical outlet is in very inconvenient places. So there are not a surplus of electrical outlets in some of the hotels in China. The area is very diverse. It's difficult to describe the vegetation because the area is so dissected that you have moist valleys and dry valleys and high elevations and steep slopes. But it's very dissected and contains plants from different floristic regions, like Sino-Japanese region, the Sino-Himalayan. They come in from different directions. So this is an assemblage of not only very unique plants, but also plants that come from, reach there from other areas. This is some of the plants at low elevations. Common plant. If you go to the Carolina Mountains, you see a lot of relatives of these, lady slippers and honeysuckles, lilies, touch-me-nots. But then if you go to the higher elevations, it's quite different. You get these alpine meadows with completely different plants that you don't find in North America. They're completely different. This is Arenaria here. These little white things are genus Pistora Polygonaceae. And this is actually the plants in this meadow are a sign of disturbance, overgrazing. You because you only start getting these cushion plants when most of the other plants, the nutritious plants, have been grazed too much. These plants come in and the animals don't eat them. One of the most interesting areas is on the border of Sichuan and Yunnan. And if anybody is interested in this area, this is a very easy place to go to. You can fly to Zhongbian, and then you can rent a car, and within one day you can go to this place. This is the pass is at 4,600 meters. The pass is down in here, and then you can explore off in these directions. This is probably one of the highest tree lines in the world. The pass is about 4,600 meters. So these trees are growing up over 15,000 feet. And these are balsam, babies, and it's mixed in with evergreen oak trees. On the south-facing slopes is mostly meadows. This is the slopes that gets the sun from the south, so it's much drier. And so on the south-facing slopes, mostly scrubby vegetation or grasslands, mostly made up of Cyperaceae. When you cross the ridge, you start getting deciduous shrubs, willows and honeysuckles, deciduous rhododendrons, and then you start getting into evergreen rhododendrons. First, they're very short ones, and then there are taller evergreen rhododendrons, and then there are some that are trees that grow 60 feet tall, and they'll be 2 or 3 feet in diameter. These are tree rhododendrons, really big. And within this area, within the Hengduan area, there are 226 species of rhododendron, which gives you some idea of just how rich this area is. This is just a small sample of a few. There's also some hybridization that goes on, but for the most part, the species are distinct. You can pick out clumps of one species, another species close by, completely different colored flowers, or they flower at a completely different time of year, or the leaves are completely different. Gentians are also one of the characteristic genera in that area. There are more than 117 species of gentians. Some of them are very tiny. This is a tiny little gentian. These are the flowers compared to a Swiss Army knife. And then there are some with very, very large flowers, clustered flowers. Primulaceae is very big. There are 115 species of primula in the area. So you can see just how diverse this area is. It's just fantastic. And to compare it with other parts of the world, this is a little chart of 9 genera. In just these 9 genera, there are 1,203 species of plants. And if you compare that with other areas, Nepal is about 500 kilometers to the west, maybe 350 miles. And rhododendron drops from 226 to 32 species. In North America, we have only 27 species of rhododendron. Pedicularis in this area, 216. And that drops very quickly. Only 37 in North America. This is all of North America. Primulas, 117, 30, and so on. The only other genus that's big in North America is the Salix. But this is all of North America. This is from the Arctic Circle all the way down to Mexico. When you think of that kind of diversity, people generally think about the tropics. People say, oh, the tropical rainforest, the most diverse places on Earth. But when you compare Kalimantan, which is this part of Indonesia, on Borneo, it sits right on the equator, and it's roughly the same size, a little bit bigger, but per square kilometer, the number of plants is almost the same. Kalimantan may have, nobody knows for sure, 11,000 to 15,000. Hengduan area may have about 10,000 species, which is very rich. This is about half all the plants in North America. This is what you think of for the rainforest. Moist forests where the plants can grow 365 days a year, no stress. And then in the Hengduan area, it's like going to the moon. The growing season here may be 100 days or 120 days, very short. You can have snow in the middle of the summer. we've had snow on July 16th. The temperature was 2 degrees below freezing centigrade, so maybe 26 Fahrenheit. So it can be cold anytime. So instead of the trees, the diversity in trees, most of the diversity is on the ground. It's these little low plants where you find so many species. Things like astragalus, 102 species, or Arenaria, 57, or 104 Aconitums, and so on, Anaphyllus. There's one Anaphyllus in North America, so 33 here, Corydalis. So it's just amazing how rich this area is. There are also very unusual plants. This is a little mint with leaves that just lie flat on the ground. And this is probably the smallest gymnosperm in the world. These are little fleshy cones. It's a ephedra. This is known as Mormon tea in North America. The weight of one of these plants, we dug it up and dried it and weighed it. It's only 52 grams. This whole tree is less than 2 ounces. So it's probably has to be the smallest gymnosperm in the world. But then growing with all these small plants are also some unusually tall plants, and they just stick up. You know, you look off in the distance, and here's a clump of plants that are knee-high or taller than knee-high, and they seem very unusual. There was a study of plants in the southern hemisphere by J.D. Hooker back in the 1840s, and he found a similar phenomenon there, that these plants were growing on islands where most of the vegetation was just dwarfed, it was just growing flat on the ground. But he found these unusual herbs, and he said these strange plants were not so startling for their size, but for their size relative to where they grow. And this is the same thing we find in the Hengduan Mountains. Even you get up to 17,000 feet, you can find a few plants that are knee-high. So how do they survive? It's just really amazing. So what I'd like to do is give some examples in a couple genera of the diversity. That they have diversity in 2 different ways. In the genus Saussurea, it's the aster family, daisy family, there are 100 plus species in the Hengduan area. There are about 300 in China, maybe 415 worldwide. And in Saussurea, most of the diversity is vegetative. Some of them grow flat on the ground, some are maybe 3 feet tall. Some of them are very hairy, some have no hairs at all. A lot of different patterns. But if you look at the flowers, you look at the inflorescences, when we describe these, when we're taking notes in the field, the description is the same for every single species. The flower color is the same, the anthers are the same, the style and stigma are the same. It's the vegetative parts that are quite different. This is another Saussurea, has pinnate leaves. This one was in late August. The ground, the puddles along the road were frozen, but these bees were still working on the flowers. It's a bumblebee. And they couldn't fly. They would just creep along the ground and pull themselves up to the flower to take nectar. It's really amazing to see these interactions. They're so cold. This is another Saussurea, very peculiar. The leaf base is purple. And if you dig this up, which we did, we were making specimens, and we dug up several of these and put them on the ground and went looking for more individuals to bring back. And when we came back, these leaves are all folded back on themselves. These plants are trying so hard to keep their leaves pressed to the ground that when you dig them up, they still push back. They're trying to find the ground. These are not wilted. They're very stiffly bent back. So if you try to fold them back out, it's very, very difficult. They resist folding back out. Another genus characteristic of the Hengduan area is Pedicularis. And in Pedicularis, you know it's a Pedicularis even when it's very small, no flowers. You can recognize it. So the diversity in Pedicularis is all in the flowers. And since it's such a characteristic genus, if you map our collections of Pedicularis, you can see roughly where we've done field work. This is, let's see, Lhasa is just here, And then this is all of eastern Tibet and western Sichuan and the northern part of Yunnan. And every place where we've collected Pedicularis is a marker. This is where we make collections of many plants. But it shows you just how extensive Pedicularis is. And when you plot the number of species on the map, and you look at where the highest diversity is, it's right in Yunnan, this is Yunnan, Sichuan, Gansu, and eastern Tibet. And this is Qinghai. These don't extend over the whole province. They're mostly concentrated right in this area where the Hengduan Mountains are. And when you leave this area, diversity drops dramatically. You know, this is Guizhou province and 9 species. Guangxi province, only 1 species. Only 1 in Guangdong. Just amazing. Why are there so many species in this one area? It's just really fantastic. And this is some of the example of diversity, the floral diversity. When you identify Pedicularis, try to tell what they are. The important part is the beak. And on the different species, the beak is quite different. And you can see these are tiny little flowers. These are curled. Some of these have long floral tubes. This is a long floral tube on this one. This is not a flower stalk, not a pedicel. It's an actual floral tube. When people saw this, they thought, well, these must be pollinated by moths or butterflies because they can stick their tongue in and get nectar. But the interesting thing is that these plants don't produce any nectar. There's no reward for butterflies and moths. So what I think this is that if you build a stalk for the flower, it takes a lot of energy. You have to make thick cell walls to raise the flower up. And what these plants are doing, they're using the turgor pressure from water to hold the corolla up, the showy part up. And then once these get pollinated, this long tube collapses. The water pressure is released, and the tube just collapses. And then new flowers are raised up. It's interesting, too, when you look at Pedicularis, there's a lot of similarity between species. If you look at the morphology of this flower and the morphology of one of these, they look remarkably similar. If you made this all purple, it would look like this. But it doesn't have the long stalk. This has a regular flower stalk, a regular pedicel with thick cell walls. And this is in a raceme. Here, these plants keep all of their developing the seeds close to the ground where it's warmer. So they've adapted to different ecological conditions and different pollinator types. It's another pair of species that have similar morphologies, but then completely different flower colors. These flowers and these look very similar. And then there's some very weird Pedicularis. This one has very hairy corollas. These look sort of like dragons. And you wonder, what's the driving force for all these different species? And most likely it's the pollinators. The pollinators are driving the selection. There have been very few studies of pollination in this area. There have been very few studies of anything because it's been such a hard area to reach. When we started going there, it would take us a week or more just to drive to the first field site, leaving Kunming.
Oh, wow.
But now there are airplanes in Zhongdian. You can fly from Kunming or other places directly to Zhongdian, and then you can take a car. Within one day, you can see things like this. So there are very few pollination studies. But one that was done recently was on Pedicularis. One of the people who goes to China with me, Rick Reed, had a student who started going to China and just looking at Pedicularis and trying to determine what was pollinating the flowers. And he noticed that the beak on the flowers was very important in orienting the bees. When the bee approaches the flower, they have to somehow get past the beak to get at the pollen, because pollen is the reward. And so for some, they can go in directly. Others, they have to twist on the side. Others go in underneath. So when they visit each flower, the pollen is deposited on a different part of the body. So when they visit another flower, the pollen matches the same species. It's interesting too that the greatest diversity of bumblebees in the world is in that same area. It's in the Hengduan Mountains. There are some studies of bee diversity, and within the Hengduan Mountains, there are 65 species of bumblebees. When you go down to the southern hemisphere, there are almost none. The one area in the United States or North America that has a lot is in the Pacific Northwest. But 65 species of bumblebees, a rather amazing number of bees. And then when you look at distribution in China, most of them are right down here. This is Sichuan. And they're right down in western Sichuan and eastern Tibet, Yunnan. And then within Sichuan itself, they're all up on the plateau. So they're all up over 4,000 meters, up over 12,000 feet. This is a very interesting plant. This is a delphinium. And these are not bees in the flowers. This is actually part of the flower. And it looks like it's being visited by bees. And we were wondering if this is an example of mimicry. Are these trying to mimic some of the bees in the area? This is known in orchids. There are orchids in the Mediterranean area and in Australia that look like wasps or other kinds of Hymenoptera. And they attract male bees because they resemble female bees. There's a whole series of these. And the male bees are attracted often by scents. The flowers give off the same scent as the female bee. And the bees try to mate with them. This is in Australia. Again, it looks like flowers. But these orchids are very clever, you know. They can imitate anything. And they know that human beings like orchids very much. And so some of them try to look I suppose it helps them get pollinated and produce more of themselves. But this one, you click on that screen. Like I can't do it with this. Just yeah, this shows one of the bees in Europe trying to pollinate one of these bee mimic flowers. You can tell he's confused. I mean, if he's there, he doesn't really know what's going on. And in the process of trying to mate with this flower, he's picking up pollen. And then we'll go off and find another flower and deposit on another flower. You can see he's picked up one of the polinias attached to his rear end. These orchids are really very clever. There are also a number of strange phenomena in this area. There are a number of plants that look like they have adaptations that act like a greenhouse. And this is rather unusual because it happens not only in closely related plants, but often in very different families. And they do this by having leaves or bracts that are modified, and they cover up the flowers and the inflorescence. In doing so, they cause the flowers to be much warmer than the surrounding air. They often produce a scent that attracts insects. And the insects go inside and they walk around on the flowers and they get warm, and then they escape and they go off and they start getting cold and go in another one to distribute pollen. This is another Saussurea. These plants grow in very rocky places, on ledges. You can see inside, it's just like a greenhouse. It just covers up the inflorescence. This is a rhea. It's a relative of rhubarb. And again, it's these bracts that cover the flowers. If you lift up the bracts, the flowers are inside. And this plant is dioecious. The male and female are on different individuals. And so to transport pollen, the insects have to go into the male flowers, pick up the pollen, and then fly off to the female flowers. So it's a place to eat and get warm and pick up pollen and go off and satisfy the needs of the flowers. This is another Saussurea. There's a different type of protection. This is a lily. This grows close to the ground, and instead of a greenhouse, it looks like an umbrella covering the flowers. This is a better representation of what it looks like when it's alive. This is a delphinium. Again, it's smaller, but it again acts like a greenhouse. These are translucent. The insect goes inside, can pick up pollen and nectar, and then go off and visit other flowers. This is the Solanaceae tomato family. This genus Przewalski is endemic to the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. And this is Apiaceae. And you wonder, is this a plant, in the early stages of becoming one of these greenhouse plants? You can imagine these bracts eventually, over many thousands of years, growing up to completely cover the flowers. And they're already translucent. And then another group of plants that the Japanese have called these in the Himalayan region snowball plants or sweater plants. And it's because they're covered with lots of hairs. And they tend to grow in very unstable places. These are scree slopes. These are rocks that are lifted up from the ocean. And if you look at the rocks here, you can often find fossils in them, or these square holes, or probably where salt crystals dissolved out as the rocks rose up. So this is about 4,600 to 4,700 meters, over 15,000 feet. And these plants growing on these slopes are some of these sweater plants. They tend to look like this. They're completely hairy, completely covered with hairs. Something like this, or like this. They look like they're big, fantastic rock garden plants, but I don't think they would grow here at all. Look at the amount of hair on these things. I mean, it's just incredible to think how our plant can produce so much hair. Unfortunately, this is not good for the plants because in China, people put a lot of, they attach a lot of medicinal value to unusual plants. And this is an unusual plant that's now being over-harvested and sold as tea, medicinal tea. So I think it's the rhinoceros plant world. At one time, we could find these fairly close to where we were doing field work, and now it's almost impossible. Except if you go to a town. If you go to a town, you can find these medicinal plant shops, and they're just covered with them. And these, the Tibetan nomads go up into the meadows in the summer. They set up their tents, the animals graze, and while the animals are grazing, the people can wander off everywhere. They don't have television, they don't read books, they have nothing to do, and so they go out and harvest these plants and then bring them back to the stores and sell them. So they're very, very quickly disappearing. There are also plants that blend in with the stones. And they're often the same color as stones, and they also grow in these same places. This is a Corydalis. Its leaves are completely black. There's no hairs at all on this plant. And then the Thalictrum, meadow rue. This is growing up around 4,600 meters, around 15,000 feet. And again, the sepals and the leaves blend in very closely with the rocks. This is a Fritillaria delabea. But the interesting thing is that it's growing with one of these so-called sweater plants, one of these plants with lots of hairs. This plant has no hairs at all, but it has a thick cuticle that looks very similar to the rocks. And I think what's happening, there's been some Japanese studies that show that inside these hairy plants, the stem is much warmer. But I think what's happening is that these plants grow in such exposed areas and such high elevations that the solar radiation is extremely sharp, very harsh. And there are two ways to protect against solar radiation. One is to produce hairs, which reflect the light. Another one is to produce a thick cuticle that also reflects the light. So I think if someone's interested in physiological processes, these would be good plants to study. The interesting thing is that as these mountains were lifted up, there were a number of tropical plants that were able to adapt as the mountains were going up. And some of these are Bignomiaceae. You have trumpet vines here. You can go up to almost 5,000 meters, almost 15,000 feet, and you can see flowers as big as trumpet vines growing on these little herbaceous plants growing on these rocky slopes. It's really, really amazing. And then there are also members of the ginger family. gingers are mostly tropical and subtropical. But here, up about 3,500 to 4,000 meters, you can find relatives of ginger growing. These plants survive these harsh winters. There are also a number of endemic genera in the area. In China itself, there are a little over 200 genera that occur nowhere else in the world except in China. And of those, about 100 of them are just in the Hengduan area, and 30 herbaceous genera in the Hengduan area. They occur nowhere else in the world. They're restricted totally to the Hengduan area. These are some examples of Nemoclemma, Trigiella, 2 species of Salwinia, Przewalskia, some gentians, and some composites. And these are all called neo-endemics. They're believed to have evolved very, very recently as the mountains were uplifted. We have all of these, a lot of these photos on the web, and we have a website if you want to search what's in the area, or find out if you can go to this area. You can search the website and find out which plants are in the areas you want to visit. You can go into specimens and do a browse, and then you can just search for plants with images. And I selected this Echinopsis. You can click on one of these, and that will bring you up information about that particular collection. For every photograph we have herbarium specimens. So if you come along and you say, I think you misidentified this, we can go back and look at the herbarium specimen, and we can compare that with other specimens and verify the identification. There's a map that goes with each of these, so you can see exactly where this was collected. You can click on this. It's a Google map, you can enlarge it. And then if you click on the locality information, you can see other plants that are growing there. On the website too, once you bring up one of these collections, there's a little button on the upper right that says Flora of China. If you click on that, it brings up the description from the Flora of China. So you can get a full description of the plant, a scientific description. And then you can also see where it grows, alpine meadows, and then flowering season, flowers May to August, fruit August to October. So if you're looking for seeds or something, you can go at the right time. And then there are illustrations. You can also search for localities, like if you're going to Sichuan, you can type in Sichuan. And then if you're looking for a particular county within Sichuan, you can select that. And it brings up a series of thumbnails. You click on one of these markers, and it brings up a set of thumbnails. And if you want to see what it looks like along this ravine, you can click on one of these thumbnails, like here, and that shows you exactly what it looks like on the ground. So you can see it from the air, and then you can see it. It's almost like being in person, but nothing's really like being there in person. We also have a gazetteer. If you're using herbarium specimens, Western botanists who went to this area used many different transliterations for Tibetan or Chinese names. So somebody went from Sweden, they translated as it would be pronounced in Swedish. Someone from France as French, someone from German as German. And if you can't determine what it is on the label, you can type it in here, you can enter it, you can type it in Tibetan if you want, or Chinese, or just on the label, and hit enter. This is for Kangding, and it shows you exactly where Kangding is, and then it shows you all the different names that have been used for this location. So I think for many scientists this is quite handy, because oftentimes you don't know where some of these obscure names are. We also, during our field trips, collect mosses and fungi. We try to collect as much of the biodiversity as possible. And we also try to photograph a lot of the mosses. So there are a lot of moss photographs on the website too. These again are all linked to specimens. And the same with fungi, many different fungi. This area is very interesting because there are a lot of fungi that parasitize insects. And once they parasitize insects, they eat the whole insect and then they produce a mushroom. And some of them are very interesting because the insects normally would pupate. They reach a size where they pupate. They would normally go underground. But when they're infected by this fungus, the fungus causes them to start climbing up branches. So instead of pupating underground, they climb up. Then the mushroom sends up its cap with the spores and releases the spores. So it affects the minds of the insect. It's really amazing. But I mentioned earlier how interesting the people are. The people in this area have been incredibly nice. Everywhere we go, people are incredibly friendly and smiling. We've been invited into some of the nomadic tents on cold days. They invite us in and give us yogurt, hot milk, cheese. A lot of them like to have the picture taken. Some of them don't like to have the picture taken. These were women. We were out in the field all day, and we were coming back. We got to the road, and they were walking along the road, and they were spinning yarn. And it was the first year I had a digital camera, and so I wanted to take that photo. And she said no, and she just shook her head. And then when she turned, I took it from the side, and I went up and showed it to her. And then she got interested, and then she let us take photos from the front. And then when I went to show her those, she was looking at her photo. She was looking at her photo, and I had short sleeves on. She was rubbing my arm. And she turned to her friend and she says, Maunu, Maunu. And it turns out this is a Maunu. We know them as yaks. But the interesting thing is, I'll show you, these cultures are also endangered. But this guy, this is Tibetan. And you can see his arm. He's totally glabrous, no hairs at all on his arm. So when you get a Westerner who goes into these areas, we attract a lot of attention. You can't believe this. We're like real barbarians. But all of these, this culture is disappearing. This is a monk on the left and two of the local girls in traditional clothing. And this was in 2000. Then we went back to the same area again in 2004. And they've given up their traditional dress. Everybody wants to wear Western clothes. There are satellite dishes on all the houses. So people see television programs piped in from Beijing or Hong Kong or wherever, and they want to look like all the rest of us. So they give up on the traditional clothes and all using Western clothes. In the year 2000, our first trip to Tibet, everybody rode horses. We would be on the road. We would be the only car. And often in the distance on the meadows, you'd see one or several people riding horses. And they would be going to or from markets, carrying all their supplies on the back of the horse. This is a bundle of tea. In 2004, in just 4 years, they started paving the roads in Tibet. And people traded in their horses for motorcycles. So in 2004, it was about 50-50, half motorcycles, half horses. Now if you go back, it would be very rare to find someone riding a horse. Almost everyone has a motorcycle or now a car. Tea also was carried up by humans. It was carried by humans or by horses. This had to come from Sichuan or Yunnan. And in the past, it would take a couple of months carrying this on someone's back or on the back of a sweating horse. And so when the tea got there, it had a particular flavor. And now, when the trucks started carrying tea, this is tea on the right, carried by trucks. Some of the Tibetans were complaining, said, this tea is no good, it doesn't taste like the tea we had before. But everything has to be carried. Initially, this area was all Tibetan. And then in recent years, there's been a big influx of Han Chinese. Tibetan cities that were 100% Tibetan are now maybe 40% Tibetan, 60% Han Chinese, or even more. But there's not enough food in the area. When you get above about 3,600 meters, you can only grow barley. It's impossible to feed many people on barley. The population in the past was not so large. You could live on barley and animal products, yogurt, milk, meat. But now everything has to be carried up. Pigs, it's very terrible to get stuck in traffic behind a truckload of pigs. It's already been on the road for several days. They have to carry up all the vegetables. This all comes from Sichuan. Chickens have to be carried up. Eggs have to be carried up. The population of Tibet is over the carrying capacity of the land by a very long shot. And with the new roads, and with many more people buying cars, there's also a great danger of accidents. When we first started doing field work in this area, the most dangerous part of the field work was worrying about landslides or going over the side of the cliff. But now the biggest danger is that you're going to be going around a corner, and one of these new drivers, there's so many millions, thousands of millions of new drivers on the road, and they often don't realize they have to stay on one side. And as they go around the corner, somebody's coming up on the same side as you're on. This is what happens. This is a very pretty scene, but it's a sign of overgrazing. These are Tibetan tents down here. It's where the people bring their animals in the summer. And all of this color here is a sign of overgrazing. They've eaten off all the vegetation. And instead, what you have now is this plant of the Borneo. It's very pretty, but it's totally inedible. Nothing can eat it. And it just fills in all these overgrazed areas. And the reason for that is because there are so many Chinese tourists going to these areas now. They want to go up and see what it's like. They want to ride horses, or they want to see yaks or something. But they go up, and then the Tibetans see this as a way of making money, so they're selling yak meat to the tourists. This is dried yak meat. The only English on here says fine dried, but in Chinese it says dried yak meat. We also see signs of climate change, warming of the area. These were pictures that were taken just 2 years apart. On the left in 2004 and on the right in 2006. Some of this is new snow, but if you look at the size of the glaciers, permanent ice, you can see that even the permanent ice has shrunk considerably in just 2 years. And there are a lot of people who go to some parts of the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, and they said some of the glaciers are melting back almost 300 feet per year, which is very, very fast. And when you think that about a third of the people on Earth are depending on melting glaciers, not melting so fast, but steady melt over years for their water supply, it's going to be very critical to think of what's going to happen to these people in a few years if all of this ice disappears. Already there's a plan. It's being built now. These canals from the upper Yangtze River to Beijing to supply water to Beijing. A few years ago, there was a big drought in Shanghai. So what do you do if there's a shortage of water in Shanghai and you're piping the river that flows through Shanghai to Beijing? Do you let those people go without water? Or do you take the water away from Beijing? It's going to be a real serious problem. But oil was the problem in the 20th century. But I think in many parts of the world, water will be a big problem in this century. So we still want to go back there. We've trained a number of students, both American and Chinese. There were 9 students who got Ph.D. from being involved in our projects. We were able to help them with field work through the funding we've done. And there's still lots of areas we'd like to explore. There's some areas we didn't explore enough because the grants we had were for what's called biological survey and inventory. And it meant that we had to go to try to cover the whole area. We couldn't spend a whole lot of time in one area, but we had to cover it well enough so that we could understand the whole area. And so there are many areas that we would have liked to spend a week where we only spent 1 day or 2 days. So we'd like to go back to those places too. And we've been fortunate. We had a lot of good institutes to work with in China, particularly the Kunming Institute of Botany, who has helped arrange all of the trips. We've had people from the Institute of Botany in Beijing, several funding agencies, and some really, really good field companions. Rick Reed designed the website. He takes care of the website. And Susan Kelly, who's working on the project, developed the gazetteer. So we've been very fortunate. I've been very fortunate that we've had such good people that help us. been able to get money to go here. I hope all of you have a chance to go. It's really easy. If you write to me, I'll give you information about how to get there, people that you can contact to help. But thank you very much. The question was, when do we go? We tend to go from July to September because there were a lot of people interested in rhododendron very early on, so we don't want to collect rhododendrons. And we've been trying to go to places that people haven't been before. So we know where Joseph Rock collected, we know where the Chinese went, and we know where they went and what seasons. And so we try to go different places at different seasons so that we can add to the knowledge of the area. So it's mostly August and into early September. That's when the primroses flower, lots of asteraceae. It's a good time. If you want to see rhododendrons, April is the time.
When you go to a place like this, what is your biggest concern from the standpoint of your own safety or your concerns?
I wasn't going to get in a car accident. I think if I'm going to die, it's going to be in a car accident in China.
Leeches.
No, really, you know, you get 100 million new drivers on the road. Just got that license 2 months ago.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous.
So what about poisonous snakes or spiders and things like that? No.
There are some snakes that go up to about 3,700 meters, poisonous snakes, but usually not a problem.
I have just one follow-up question. From the standpoint of rarity concepts, do they have rare plants in an area like that, or is it just...
Yeah, a lot of these are rare, and a lot of them occur only in these areas. There are some where all the plants in the world easily fit in this room. Yeah, this Mount Obey in Sichuan province is very famous. There are a lot of plants only grown in one mountain. And then they're distinct. They're not micro-species. They're very distinct species, different from everything else.
It looks like to me you're bringing back specimens, but not live plants.
Right.
So why?
Oh, it's so much trouble. Have you ever tried to take wild plants out of China? It's very, very difficult. We tried it the first few years, and then it became so hard. And it also takes a lot of time because you have to clean the seeds, and you have to spend a lot of time in one place. So to do this inventory, we've just been collecting specimens.
Are there any concerns with putting the localities so precisely online because there's so many endemics and endangered plants that people will?
Well, I don't think so, personally. You know, if people want to get these things, they're going to get them whether you put it online or not. They're going to find a way. We've had people come into our herbarium and steal herbarium specimens of orchids.
Does China want to protect them at all? Are they doing?
China has a lot of nature preserves, an awful lot now. When I first started going there, basically none. They were protecting the panda, but now there are hundreds scattered around the country. They don't get much protection though. They have the names as nature preserve, but there are no people watching them. They're not used the way we use them. There may be national parks or something, but there are animals still grazing and people still living there.
So, when are you going back again?
May.
Every year?
No, I try to go every year, but it's getting money is difficult. Funding agencies don't want to give you money just for field work.
So when you go, for how long?
In May, it'll be just for 2 weeks. But usually it's about 2 months. One time it took a week to get into the field or more, and then you have a week coming back or more, and then we need probably a week to process the collections. So there's 3 weeks, and it doesn't leave much time in the field. So 2 months is about minimum.
have you found that local informants were in any way, were local informants ever helpful in locating new species? As far as like, people with local knowledge of, not necessarily trained botanists, but more like with lay knowledge of knowledge.
No, local people have been always very curious about what we're doing, but they never seem to volunteer anything. People will come. If you're just with the animals, you don't have anything to do. Why not sit there and watch the foreigners for a whole morning or something? They don't really add anything. Occasionally, somebody will bring up something that's interesting, but haven't had anybody point out anything that's unique.
What is China's policy about taking seeds?
Well, you're supposed to get permission. You can ask Tony Avon back there. What is your experience?
I haven't been in a while, so back when we were there, we were allowed to do whatever we wanted. We paid well for that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, USDA changed it, and other countries followed suit. We can still get seed out pretty easy.
Yeah, we take, if it's something that somebody needs for research, we can get a small amount of seeds, but if you're wholesale collecting seeds, it's very difficult, because everything that goes out of China is X-rayed. And if you're carrying something and you don't have a permit, you can get in a lot of trouble. So it's better to do everything according to the law.
What are the health issues on your trips other than automobile accidents? And do you eat locally? Everything
Yeah,
you want,
we eat locally. I tend to be rather careful. If something looks suspicious, I don't touch it. We've had some people get sick, but antibiotics will usually clear it up in a couple of days. So food has generally been quite good.
oxygen level?
Oh, oxygen level. Some of those elevations about 65% of sea level, and it takes a while. The one thing about going for just 2 months is that after 2 months you feel wow, I feel great. Then you have to leave. That's a real problem.
I was just wondering what communication was like, or how much trouble you have talking to people who are in those remote villages. How can you communicate?
Well, all the people we are with speak English. English is
And they can't talk to
pardon?
they can't talk to the different indigenous groups.
Yeah. Well, this Mandarin is the standard language in China, and then we can speak English with the people we're collaborating with. All the students speak English now, and then they communicate with the local people. So it's very easy. And then cell phone towers are everywhere in China now. Cell phones are more convenient in China than they are in the United States. And if you go to high mountains, there are cell phone towers. They have solar panels to run them, or they have little windmills generating electricity. So everywhere there's cell phone access, even very remote places.
Are there many non-native species, and is the percentage of those changing over time?
No, they're very few, and the ones that we think may be non-native, they may be native. Things like Tribulus terrestris, which is all over the world. We find that growing in sandy places along places like the Mekong River. But it's hard to know if it's native or introduced. And Coniza canadensis is all over the place. And people wonder if that's native to North America now. They think it may have been Asian or from somewhere else. So some of these things we may think of as being non-natives when they're there, but they may actually be natives. But at that elevation, there are not many plants that are pre-adaptive to grow there, so they don't have to worry about invasive plants.
Does that have to do with the diversity already being higher, so such that when you've got a disturbance, like in the middle of the there are such a high diversity, that we're already got something that's adapted enough to take advantage of that?
Yeah, it's like that last slide, but that valley that's been overgrazed, there's a native plant, that microrula is a native plant. As soon as you get disturbance, that comes in. And then maybe eventually, after hundreds of years, something else will come in and gradually replace it. But if you've got all these animals grazing, it's very hard to move beyond that. Those microlulas just keep spreading. It's very pretty, but not diverse at all.
This would grow in this area.
I think it would be very difficult. I think the climate is just, it's very, very wet in the summer. We've had, middle of July, we've been in snow, we've been snowing on us, below freezing temperatures. July 16th one year.
I'm curious about the hotspot area. Could you give us an example of another hotspot area of a similar size?
Oh, they're all
I'm
different.
having trouble figuring out how big this area is.
Yeah, this is about, I think it's a little bit smaller than Texas.
Texas, okay. A little smaller, okay.
Yeah. But it's about the size of Kalimantan on Borneo. Borneo is one of these hot spots. And they vary in size. There's some that are very small. Madagascar is one. They're very big.
I noticed that the Herbarium is online.
Yes.
But I haven't, are there images of, scanned images or photographed images of type specimens available yet?
Yes, yeah, almost all the type specimens have been imaged. And, they're online through JSTOR. Unfortunately, JSTOR requires a subscription. We're working on trying to get them online so that they're available free to anybody who wants to see them. You can get a little image on JSTOR free, but if you want a detailed image, you have to be a subscriber.
I'm familiar with the Field Museum, Smithsonian,
Yeah.
New York Botanic Garden, all of that. Those are the ones that,
Yeah.
that's the ambition, to be on that, to have images on that level.
Yeah. We had funding to do the imaging, but the condition was that we make them available on JSTOR. But now we're working on a new website, and we want to make them available on our website free. It takes time.
And money.
Yeah, that's the problem. This is not a very lucrative business. It's fun though.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.